This lecture, like the last one, grew out of a course that we offered online at the Catholic thing that you can actually take. It was recorded at 6 sessions on the great St. John Henry Newman. And we had almost 600 people take that course live. I was telling the Fahey's at dinner. And there's a great deal, I think, of interest in fundamental Catholic formation like you get from reading somebody like Newman. So good for you for coming out tonight. But these are things I hope that by the end of this particular lecture you'll realize they're not just a matter of our own personal enrichment. I really think that unless we can kind of reappropriate the deep understanding of questions like conscience, like development of doctrine, within the church, but also make it present in society, we're going to have even a rougher time in the future than it looks like we're going to have. Now, so let me just dive right in about conscience. Conscience is a very complicated subject. If you talk to theologians, they beat one another up about what the proper understanding of conscience is. So I can only kind of draw the large lines that Newman laid out in his understanding of conscience. Because conscience, people talk about conscience all the time, and they think that they have a right to do something because they're thinking about doing something in conscience. Newman would have disputed that. And I think if you just give a moment's reflection to the idea that you can do what you want because you've reflected on it in yourself and you've decided it's correct, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work at a practical human level because people deceive themselves about things all the time. If I can tell a personal note, my late father, great man, and my brother, who's a priest, we grew up just outside of New York, and they convinced themselves that they ought to be Boston Red Sox fans. When it was quite clear that both nature and nature's God should have made them New York Yankee fans, as I was. So, in matters both small and, of course, greater matters, too. We hear all the time about people telling us that the right to kill children in the womb or to commit acts of sodomy are things that, in conscience, we should be permitting them to do. This has led to widespread slaughter in the world. There are something between 40 and 60 million people killed by abortion every year. It's the largest cause of death in the world. Right? So, look, let's start out in a simple way. Conscience clearly is, the question of conscience is clearly about making the right choices about what we are to do. Everybody understands that, right? But here's the further question, and this is where Newman, I think, is especially helpful for us right now. How do we know what is to be done except on the basis of what is? What is the world like? Because you can make anything up and come up with a rationalization for why you can do something, but we have to know what the world is, which is to say what the truth is, if we're going to be able to make a decision about how we are to conduct ourselves in the world. And in addition to that, as Newman would argue, it's not enough to know about something, but we have to recognize what our responsibility is toward that truth. So moral reasoning is important, but moral formation of people so that our consciences are actually in harmony with the truth and the reality of the world is a complicated question. But even though I've said this is not to say that it's easy to determine these things. Newman talks in various places in his works about how people say, well, look, it's unnatural for us to be humble or to be chaste or to be prayerful, to have a sense of responsibility to God. And he says, well, yes, of course it's unnatural for us now because we're in a fallen state. That if we're not weakened by original sin or we're not malformed by the bad habits we've developed in the course of our lives, it would be a lot easier for us to all see what the truth of situations are and to be able to act more easily in accord with that truth. But we're sinners, we're imperfect, and it's only by recognizing that we prepare ourselves actually to address the whole question of conscience. So far I've been putting this in Christian terms, okay? And obviously there are a lot of people out there in the world who are going to think about that and say, well, that's okay for Christians. This idea that we have to recognize what the world is and then our responsibilities towards us. Well, I was preparing just today over in my hotel room. I'm teaching T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets tomorrow to students at Thomas More College. And I was rereading that wonderful poem in preparation for the morning. And I noticed there's a quotation that what Eliot puts right at the beginning of his poem. And it goes like this. Tu logo de eontos suno zoiosin hoi poloi hos idian e contos phronesin. Eliot puts stuff in Greek at the beginning of his poems because it kind of set the critics back on their heels. They thought he was a learned guy. Well, all this means very simply is, though the logos is common to all. This is a quotation from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus. So this is not a Christian now. This is someone prior to Socrates who dies around the year 400. So he's saying, though the logos is common to all, many people live as if they possess their own wisdom, their own idea of what's right and wrong. Now, Heraclitus is sometimes called obscure, but I don't think there's any doubt about what even this pagan philosopher is implying here. Logos is one of these words that has so many meanings in Greek, it's almost impossible to translate it. It means reason, it can mean a story, it can kind of mean rationality. But logos is also the very term that St. John the Evangelist uses in the very first line of his gospel. In the beginning was the Word, was the logos. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So there's this kind of, what I would call a convergence between that Christian understanding of the truth of things, the logos that exists in things as being common to all, and yet people ignore it and they act as if they have their own wisdom that is superior to that common reason. And you can find this in other ancient non-Christian philosophers as well. So there's really a kind of a consensus here about what the truth is about things, how we are to find the basis to conduct our lives. It's what, if you've ever read C.S. Lewis's wonderful little book, The Abolition of Man, he calls it the Tao. And he toward the end of that book, if you've read it, there's a kind of an appendix with sayings from various cultures, various religions, and it's amazing how much they all kind of harmonize with one another. And he's able to go out and do that because this is the common patrimony of humanity. Now, Lewis felt it was necessary to write that book in 1943 to kind of establish some foundations for things that were rapidly slipping away. And of course, since 1943, a lot of other things have slipped away and even farther away from us. And as a result, what we see around us are a lot of people who are, to put it quite mildly, have very poorly formed consciences, in the sense that they've not been taught, not been taught much at all about how to live their lives, whether it's in schools, even in the church in many instances, not even in families when there are intact families, and the breakdown of the family is one of the critical points where we lose the possibility of forming people's consciences properly, because it's in that kind of affection within a family that you can actually appeal to people to understand why it is that they should do certain things and should not do other things. I think probably we're all Americans here today, so I'm going to speak a bit about the American situation. It's the one that I know the best, and maybe you all know the best as well. And I think we can say with a certain amount of confidence that what most Americans today believe about conscience is not what I've been talking about up till now, but they believe that it means making up your own mind about things. Now, if you've got a well-formed mind and you've developed a certain amount of virtue, maybe that's something that you can appeal to. But I don't think as a general rule, and we can see this in the society around us, I don't think there's a general rule that's been working out very well for us. And of course, there's a kind of a death spiral here, that the more people who are out in society who don't have well-formed consciences and therefore behave badly or rationalize what they're doing, it tends to lower the level of how we talk about things in general and make it much more difficult to talk about in public what's right, and then much more difficult to encourage people to do things that are right. If you look at what happened throughout the world, it's interesting that most of our better opinions have been formed by Christianity, even by the people who today don't consider themselves to be Christians or to follow a Christian ethos in their lives. And there are some pretty fundamental things that we all talk about that would not have been the case in other societies. For example, we pretty much all believe, for example, that killing innocent human beings is wrong. That's not always been the case throughout cultures in history. Not something every culture has believed. The kind of chattel slavery that existed here in the United States for a while, pretty much meaning people could own other people and do what they want with them, has been abolished primarily because of the Judeo-Christian idea that we're all made in God's image and likeness. And even though it took a while for that to spread out, even here in the United States, it's something now that we hold because of a certain inheritance from Christianity. So it's not surprising that as Christianity has been disappearing from a lot of people's individual lives, that we start to see ourselves accepting things like abortion that I mentioned earlier, and we're starting to see less respect about human life in things like assisted suicide, excuse me one second, assisted suicide and euthanasia. They all get justified, and they are justified by people with certain rationalizations if they feel that they have to do this. For reasons. You can make up reasons why almost anything can be regarded as okay in conscience, right? We see this all the time. These kind of sentimental and gadget-obsessed society that we live in, people think that it's not all that big a deal to indulge bad behavior because someone will come along and straighten things out. And so we can talk about doing bad things on utilitarian grounds. It's not all that serious. We're going to just allow people to do this because we have to tolerate it as a course of, in the course of American liberty. When we talk about abortion, we talk about women and families not being ready to have a child, that the elderly, for example, are going to be a drain on society, a drain on the young and healthy people in our society. And so even the basic prohibition against killing, which you would think is killing innocent people, what you would think is kind of the most fundamental thing we could possibly say, as we see our consciences not being formed well to what is, and as we would probably be able to say all together, what is includes God. Now, Newman takes a very different view from this, what I've called our view of conscience, meaning what is kind of the man in the streets view, that he can do whatever he wants because we're free, we have the power to do this. There's a famous letter that Newman wrote, and it's called The Letter to the Duke of Norfolk. Actually, it's a long book, but it came about because there was a dispute about papal infallibility, and he was asked to respond in England to people who were upset about the idea that the Pope was so-called infallible in virtually everything. And here's what Newman begins to say about the duties that conscience calls us to. The rule and measure of duty is not utility, nor expedience, nor the happiness of the greatest number, which is a utilitarian principle, nor state convenience, nor fitness, order, and the pulchrum, the beautiful. He quotes this in Latin. Conscience is not a long-sighted selfishness, nor a desire to be consistent with oneself, but it is a messenger from him who both in nature and in grace speaks to us behind a veil and teaches and rules us by his representatives. Conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. Let me say that again. Conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ, a prophet in its informations, a monarch in its peremptoriness, a priest in its blessings and anathemas. And even though the eternal priesthood through the church should cease to be, in it the sacerdotal principle would remain and would have a sway. So to put this in slightly less Victorian English, he's saying that the conscience, properly formed, is a type of priest, a prophet, and a king. But just to claim that that's what conscience is does not mean that we hand over that kind of authority to conscience. Priests, prophets, and kings come from where? Come from somewhere, and they go towards somewhere, and they have responsibilities. Now, Newman makes such a sweeping claim about conscience because he believes some other things. I mentioned this in the previous lecture about how his idea of development of doctrine isn't just whatever happens to take place in some people's minds, that the development, as opposed to a corruption, is guided by certain principles to which he was committed and he believed all Christians had to be committed. And let me just go through these again quickly. The first one, he says, is the dogmatic principle, meaning that in the Christian religion is not a religion of feeling. I think we all know that there's a lot of that sort of thing that's going around even in the Catholic Church these days, but Newman affirmed that the Christian religion is a dogmatic religion. It's concerned with truth and not merely feeling. Obviously, feelings come into it along the way. So truth is an important thing that's going to guide everything else that happens. Second is that we need a visible church. Now, Catholics, of course, would call that the mystical body of Christ, and this is the church that has perdured through history in the same way that the Jewish people carried the revelation of Christ before Christ was incarnated on earth. And finally, Newman says that there has to be, in that visible institution that we call a church, there has to be Catholicity. Now, he resisted the Roman Catholic Church for many years. He believed that there were three forms of true Catholicity. There was Eastern Orthodoxy, there was Anglo-Catholicism, the English form of Catholicism, and Roman Catholicism, which he thought was corrupted, partly corrupted because of the popes, but obviously he came around to a different view of that. Now, I would like to attach these principles, dogmatical principle, a visible institution, and the universality, which is what Catholicity means. I want to try to reconnect these to the idea that I started out with, that conscience depends on knowing what the world is, right, and what the reality of the world entails for us. Because we have free will, we can make a decision to do something bad, but we can also make decisions to do things that are good. And so what this means for us is that properly understood, once we know truth, it means several things. Some of the early church fathers, for example, used to talk about the physical world, the material created world, as a second book of Revelation. The Bible, obviously, is the first book, and that nature is the second book of Revelation. That God speaks to us not only through the special revelation we get in our religious tradition, but through created things. And so therefore we seek, even when we're doing science and we're practicing theological disciplines, we're trying to understand what's been given to us in the world. What is this world that we find ourselves in? What are our very selves, for that matter? So let me make a jump from this to what may seem like a giant leap for some of you, to explain some of the things about our current predicament. It's only when a culture has abandoned this notion of respecting what's been given to us that a Supreme Court justice, and a nominal Catholic Supreme Court justice at that, could say, in the Casey decision, I'm quoting here, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life." That was Justice Kennedy, of course, in the Casey decision. Some people refer to this as the mystery passage, where It's, it's not just that we make decisions on the basis of the circumstances that we're in, prudential decisions, or that we try to apply an ethical principle in certain circumstances. But this is really defining the meaning of the universe. I mean, it's arrogating to ourselves basically the divine prerogative to say what is true and what is right and what we're going to do for ourselves. And it makes us we make ourselves into a kind of idol of God by doing that. The classical view, the one that I've been developing, that existed even in the pre-Socratics and that exists in Newman, is that we're given a universe, that it's important to recognize. We can still have troubles discerning what it means, even being given that universe, what it means to live that reality out. We can make different judgments, and that isn't necessarily even a matter of conscience. It's a matter of trying to think things through. But this leap that I'm trying to make here is that when everything is subjected to an individual human being's self-definition, and the conscience becomes just what I think, and it's not anchored anywhere in reality, especially in the kind of the universality that the church represents, because over hundreds of years, thousands of years now, even going back into the history of the Jews, these truths have endured the rise and fall of cultures, entire civilizations, and they've proven themselves to have truth and a living value. Someone once said that tradition just is a series of experiments that worked. And the reason we have a tradition that continues is those experiments worked and they come down to us. It's an interesting way to think about it, actually, right? Contrast that, for example, with the kind of thing that we see in the culture where a baby is born, right? And now what we're told about that baby being born is that someone comes along and assigns it a gender at birth. You've all heard that phrase, right? On the birth certificate, the baby gets an assigned gender. I don't know who the assigner is, but apparently someone doesn't just see a baby boy or a baby girl come out and say, "Oh yeah, it's a boy, it's a girl." This too kind of reflects back on that deep understanding that somehow we can change even those fundamental perceptions that we have. The Bible says male and female, he created them, but you didn't need the Bible in almost any culture in the world for thousands of years to know that babies are born either as boys or as girls, in very rare cases, maybe with some sort of sexual deformity, but fundamentally human beings are born boys or girls and grow up to be men or women. Now, I want to point out that the second of Newman's, that's on the dogmatic side. The second of Newman's principles, this idea of having a visible church. Now, you could say that this is just a Roman Catholic claim, that the church is the church is authoritative. But I think people misunderstand what he's saying about this. It's clear that the church, if a church is going to be the continuation and the guide of God's revelation to the world, it has to be a visible church. And it has to be a church that we recognize as having authority because it keeps teaching those things that go all the way back to Christ and even back into the Jewish revelational tradition. By contrast, and I'm sorry to have to use this term because it's current in Rome, and I hear it whenever I'm in Rome, a listening church, a solely listening church, is not an authoritative church. It's not a visible church that guides us. I wrote a book, The God That Did Not Fail, a few years ago. It's sort of a whole history of how Christianity continued, even though people thought it was going to disappear at many points over the last 2,000 years. And one of the things I discovered as I got near the Reformation was that once a visible church having authority disappears, things go wild. So within just a few decades of Martin Luther, there were over 250 different theories about what the Eucharist is. And it's not surprising, because if people are going to make up their own minds about, well, I read the Bible and I saw it said this here and that there, and you can make almost any rationalization you want about what the truth of things is, it's not surprising that you have over 250 interpretations, even of something like the Eucharist, where the Eucharist even continues to exist in churches. So look, in this perspective, to believe that God even speaks to us in any authoritative way cannot mean that he simply abandons us to our own understandings of what he's done. I mean, he's not like some demagogic politician who comes along in 2024 and says, well, you know, people don't want to listen to that. We have to appeal to them in a different way. He has to, unless he's left us without the means to understand what the world is and what he expects of human beings. And that has to mean that someone has got the authority to define that. And in Newman's instance, it's a visible church in the world. Then Revelation doesn't really exist. What exists is a number of books of the Bible that can be interpreted any way that we want. They don't necessarily have to harmonize with one another. People take one piece or another piece, and there's no real revelation. So to have an authoritative church is, in a way, to recognize that there has to be some authority, and since the Bible alone is not going to provide that authority, there's going to have to be an institution that's going to do so. Now, it's interesting that Newman wrote his letter to the Duke of Norfolk. The Duke of Norfolk was a member of a family which was a recusant family. They did not become Protestant at the time of the Protestant Reformation. They remained Catholics, but they also remained very serious patriots of England. And so the Duke of Norfolk in his day was sort of a major figure who you could point to as a model of what a good but patriotic English Catholic could be at the time. And so when he has to deal at this moment with the Protestant question, because at Vatican I, the infallibility of the Pope is proclaimed, but not in the way that Protestants think. You know, Protestants always want to think that the Pope would become a kind of a tyrant, and he would dictate to English Catholics what they could and could not do, and they therefore could not be regarded as reliable, loyal Catholics. And Newman comes along and has to deal with this question. And it's a question that's never actually very far from us, because even today, as we know, there are debates going on about things that the Pope might say. How far do they go? How far do the laity? How far do even other bishops find themselves in the position of having to follow what a given Pope has said that may appear or may actually be in contradiction with the tradition? So Newman was not a great fan of the Declaration of Infallibility, by the way. He thought that it would make trouble, and in this, as in many other instances, he was absolutely right that it went on to cause confusion in England, continues to cause confusion among us. But the one thing that Catholics always need to keep in mind, that there have only been 2 infallible declarations since the popes were declared infallible in faith and morals, and it's on 2 Marian doctrines. It's on the proclamation of the Immaculate Conception and Our Lady's Assumption into heaven. Those 2 things and those 2 things only. And even in the debates that we see in Rome these days, there's an attempt to say, well, of course we can't change Revelation on, say, matters of homosexual relations, but we can do something else that looks a little bit ambiguous. So Newman was asked to respond, and this question of what the Pope can say and what the Pope cannot say that is binding on us naturally touches the question of consciences. It touches the conscience of each of us individually, but also it touches the question of what Catholics, the relation of Catholics to the papacy, and the whole question of Catholic freedom, because there is a legitimate Catholic freedom that needs to be recognized in the Church as well. So Newman poses this problem, I'm quoting here. It seems then that there are extreme cases in which conscience may come into collision with the word of a pope. This didn't just happen in the last 11 years. And is to be followed in spite of that word. Now, I wish to place this proposition on a broader basis, acknowledged by all Catholics, And in order to do this satisfactorily, as I begin with the prophecies of Scripture and the primitive church, when I spoke of the Pope's prerogatives, so now I must begin with the Creator and his creature, when I would draw out the prerogatives and the supreme authority of conscience. So notice in this quotation, he's going to take on some of the hard cases. He's talking about extreme cases, which by their very nature, of course, would be rare, let's hope. And even in our time, I think they're rarer than most people, most Protestants who objected to the idea would have expected. Newman didn't necessarily entirely resolve this question, but he raised the right question here about proper authority and the proper role of conscience. Okay, and it's worth examining really carefully what he has to say at this point. He immediately makes this observation after that other passage that I just read. Remember, what he's talking about God. When we start to talk about who God is, obviously we talk about how we are, and we can only really understand ourselves in terms of the absolute nature of reality, which is what God himself is. So here's what he says. I say then that the supreme being is of a certain character, which expressed in human language we call ethical. He has the attributes of justice, truth, wisdom, sanctity, benevolence, and mercy as eternal characteristics in his nature, and the very law of his being identical with himself. And next, when he became creator, he implanted this law, which is himself, in the intelligence of all his rational creatures. Here I think Newman is kind of joining hands with Heraclitus and the idea that there is one common logos, and yet people go off and they think they have their own wisdom that is greater than that logos. So he's implanted this in all his rational creatures. The divine law, then, is the rule of ethical truth, the standard of right and wrong, a sovereign, irreversible, absolute authority in the presence of men and angels. The eternal law, he's quoting here, says St. Augustine, is the divine reason, again, that logos, the divine reason or will of God, commanding the observance, forbidding the disturbance of the natural order of things. That's Newman quoting Augustine. Now here he's going to quote, he continues a quotation, but now from St. Thomas. The natural law, says St. Thomas, is an impression of the divine light in us, a participation of the eternal law in the rational creature. And note the authorities he cites here, Father, Son, Augustine, Aquinas. This is the main highway of Christian theological reflection, right, about what we are and therefore what we ought to be doing and what our conscience ought to be telling us. Having all these things lined up with one another. So, where then does this conscience enter? I'm going to read you another somewhat lengthy passage, but bear with me on this. He's been talking about the law that God has implanted in us and that our conscience is looking toward. This law, as apprehended in the minds of individual men, is called conscience. And though it may suffer refraction in passing into the intellectual medium of each, it is not therefore so affected as to lose its character of being the divine law, but still has as such the prerogative of commanding obedience. Something we don't like in the modern world, obviously. Hence it is never lawful, listen carefully to this, hence it is never lawful to go against our conscience, as the Fourth Lateran Council says, quid fit contra conscientiam edificat ad Gehenna. Whoever goes against conscience is building up hell, Gehenna. Newman continues, this view of conscience, I know, is very different from that ordinarily taken of it both by the science and the literature and by the public opinion of this day. It is founded on the doctrine that conscience is the voice of God, whereas it is fashionable on all hands now to consider it in one way or another a creation of man. Close quotation there. Now, a lot has changed, obviously, in the world, in England and in the United States since Newman wrote that passage, but that clearly has not changed. Not only that we all believe that we all have some right to think and make up ethical systems as we please. But this is even long before we get to the question of papal authority, the authority of God himself, the creator. I would say even the authority of physical nature. We see this, of course, in the trans movement. The kind of limitations and definitions that the world itself gives us, all of that has been thrown out the window. I think as considered it's like a fetter on the freedom of the conscience and frankly the will, the kind of naked individual will has come to replace God, nature, everything else. There's an old Latin phrase that's used about the devil, that the devil has said, non serviam, I won't serve, right? I will not serve, which is really the root of this claim that Newman is talking about, this radically free conscience. If I can kind of quote what may seem a frivolous authority at this point, Bob Dylan, in one of his Christian albums, a friend of mine was a big fan. When I was very young, I was a fan of Bob Dylan, but a friend of mine who has been following Bob Dylan's career and really was taken by the period when he was an explicit Christian, put me onto an album of his. And there's a song in there called You Got to Serve Somebody. Now, the devil says, non serviam, I will not serve. But Bob Dylan says, you got to serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you got to serve somebody. I think he's got this exactly right. You know, coming into it as a Christian without apparently any formal training in Catholic theology or moral reflection, he's kind of hit the nail on the head. That's the dividing line between those of us who think that we're God and those of us who think that, if not God himself, something in nature may be the guiding thing for our conscience. Now, Newman allows, to go back to more serious authorities, Newman allows that most Protestants in his day at least once had this proper view of things because they believed in a creator God. So, he says, how did so much of England, and we could ask, how did so much of the developed world today come to think something quite different? Now, I think that there are two parts to understanding this. One is that scientific materialism, which is a ridiculously inadequate way to think about human beings. I mean, if you think that scientific materialism explains who you are, then you have to ask yourself how you get an explanation out of a description of matter and energy. There's no jump from that view of the world to a mind, to the freedom of the will, to the ability to make decisions that are either good or bad. It leaves out an immense part of what is human, probably the most important part, not probably, the most important part of what it means to be human. And so this new form that science took, and science is a perfectly wonderful thing to practice. I went to university as a physics student, and until I got interested in other things, I'm not exactly sure how that happened. I've just found it fascinating the way that God had made the world. And there are lots of, when people do surveys of scientists, they find that the harder the science, in other words, the people who are into physics and chemistry, the greater percentage who are believers. The softer the science, the psychology, the social science, they tend to be less religious. But in addition to this mistaken scientific view, there's an institutional element to this. And of course, we've seen this in our time in the way that medicine has been corrupted, the way that the legal profession has been corrupted, the way that even journalism has become something other than reporting on news and has taken on ideological dimensions. Here's what he says. Again, this is a little bit long, but bear with me. This is worth hearing from him entirely. All through my day, there has been a resolute warfare. I had almost said conspiracy against the rights of conscience as I have described it. Literature and science have been embodied in great institutions in order to put it down. Noble buildings have been reared as fortresses against that spiritual, invisible influence which is too subtle for science and too profound for literature. Chairs in universities have been made the seats of an antagonistic tradition. Public writers, day after day, have indoctrinated the minds of innumerable readers with theories subversive of its claims, it here being the right understanding of conscience. If this is starting to sound familiar, there's a reason for that, obviously. We are told that conscience is but a twist in primitive and untutored man, that its dictate is an imagination, that the very notion of guiltiness, which that dictate enforces, is simply irrational. For how can there possibly be freedom of will? How can there be consequent responsibility in that infinite eternal network of cause and effect in which we helplessly lie? The irony in this, of course, to just move this up to our own time, is on the one hand, there seems to be this increasing denial of the human things, the most human things that I was describing before, on the basis of science. If you read into literature, for example, about neuroscience, there are neuroscientists who talk about the idea of free will as a folk belief. In other words, it's kind of one of those folk tales that people tell, but it's no such thing as free will. When I hear this argument, I say, well, then why do neuroscientists even exist? I mean, we could all go to a bar and have a beer because there's nothing else we can do anyway. So, why bother trying to figure out why human beings are the way they are, et cetera. So there's the contradiction on the one hand that free will even exists, but what, on the other hand, do we find happening in society? I mean, there's this, it might be wrong to call it a conspiracy, but there's almost a totalitarian belief that certain things are absolutely beyond the moral pale of polite society. To say that a person who is trained, let me put this more simply, to mispronoun, is that the verb that they use? To use the wrong pronoun of a person is a horror that you should lose your job about, that you should be banned from TikTok, you should be banned from Facebook, you should be banned from what we call X now, right? So we've got this strange paradox going on, that on the one hand, we're supposed to follow the science, which is another thing we could talk about some other time. I don't know how you follow a value-free pursuit of objective things when it comes down to moral questions and political questions, et cetera. But it's a phrase that we hear used. But on the one hand, we've got this idea that we're all kind of just meat computers, and on the other, we've got this idea that everybody's supposed to be absolutely held responsible for the slightest infraction of certain sacred cows that now exist in the society. It's diabolical, I think, frankly, in the way that it's harmed us at both ends, both in our objective understanding and in our moral reflections. And what's the consequence of this? The consequence is that the vast numbers of people who have no idea about these higher intellectual issues, they've just absorbed these two things by a kind of a spiritual or an intellectual osmosis. And they've absorbed the internal contradictions of these ideas about modern conscience, that you can pretty much do what you want anyway because there is no order out there. There's no authority that can tell us what that order ought to be, and it certainly can't enforce behavior. So let me go back to Newman. Here's another important passage from his letter to the Duke of Norfolk. Conscience has rights because it has duties. But in this age, with a large portion of the public, it is the very right and freedom of conscience to dispense with conscience, to ignore a lawgiver and judge, to be independent of unseen obligations. It becomes a license to take up any or no religion, to take up this or that and let it go again, to go to church, to go to chapel, to boast of being above all religions, and to be an impartial critic of each of them. Conscience is a stern monitor, but in this century it has been superseded by a counterfeit, which 18 centuries prior to it never heard of, and could not have mistaken for it if they had. It is the right of self-will. I think that's it in a nutshell. I mean, even the wilder forms of self-will, the trans-changing of genders, for starters, which I think is, we were talking about this at dinner, I think it's on its way to disappearance through the quintessential American way, which is to say lawsuits. People who've been mutilated, children whose development, their puberty has been destroyed by drugs. I think that the lawsuits that are coming out of this, and we're already seeing this in England, which has blocked the use of puberty blocking drugs for children. And yet, our current president, our second Catholic president, has said that trans rights are the human rights issue of our time. I wouldn't say that our president has studied Newman or much of anything else of this sort, but to come to that point, to say that the trans issue is a human rights issue of our time, you have to consider what an enormous distortion of many, many different institutions, even for a person who claims to be a Catholic, to have arrived at that point. There's one other point that Newman has to explain to his readers back in the 19th century, and still hasn't disappeared. He says that when the 19th century popes criticized freedom of conscience, and they did not mean it was a mistaken idea of what they were saying. What they were saying is that freedom of conscience, as it was understood in the ways that I just quoted him about, meaning the self-will can decide anything it wishes, that is actually a phrase that they use in several encyclicals, is it's madness. It's a deliramenta. They even use the Latin in the Italian text because they wanted to underline that if you were to make self-will, if you make self-will what you call freedom of conscience, it's the destruction of everything. It's the destruction of everything that makes us human. So Newman puts it this way, I'm quoting, "There is no scoffing of any pope in formal documents addressed to the faithful at large at that most serious doctrine, the right and the duty of following that divine authority, the voice of conscience, on which, in truth, the Church herself is built." To do so, Newman says, would be suicidal. It would be actually a destruction of what popes are there to do, which is to lead us to form our wills to follow God. And if we were to deny the freedom of conscience in that sense, it would put the Church out of business. And that's why he calls it suicide. He talks further about the necessity for hierarchy. And let's not forget that he's speaking to an England that is probably ahead of most countries in its secularization already, even though there were a lot of Christians, serious Christians left in England in the 19th century. But he goes back to talking about the necessity for hierarchy and authority. Here's what he says. "The sense of right and wrong, which is the first element in religion, is so delicate, so fitful, so easily puzzled, obscured, perverted, so subtle in its argumentative methods, so impressible by education, so biased by pride and passion, so unsteady in its course, that in the struggle for existence amid the various exercises and triumphs of the human intellect, this sense is at once the highest of all teachers, yet the least luminous. And the Church, the Pope, the hierarchy are in the divine purpose, the supply of an urgent demand." In other words, all those reasons that we've talked about from various directions for why conscience is puzzled and it can be warped and can reach wrong conclusions, it cries out for some help in deciding not only what's true, but what is to be done. So Newman goes on. He says, "The Pope, who comes of revelation," this is quite important for us these days, "has no jurisdiction over nature. If under the plea of his revealed prerogatives, he neglected the mission of preaching truth, justice, mercy, and peace, much more if he trampled on the consciences of his subjects, if he had done so all along, as Protestants said, then he could not have lasted these many centuries now. Colloquially, I think even a lot of Catholics will say something like this. These days, with the developments of science, my conscience tells me I can't accept the real presence, the Trinity, confession to a priest, etc. And that as a Catholic, and I can name a number of figures in Washington who do this, as a Catholic, I've been given freedom of conscience by God, and therefore I'm an adult and can make up my own mind about things. Now, it's a misuse of terms for a Catholic to do this, obviously. A Catholic is somebody who's going to recognize the need for that hierarchy and that authoritative institution that Newman is talking about, and especially, as he says, because they've survived all the perils that the world can throw at any institution. I never tire. When I founded the Catholic thing, I said that we have the longest cultural, spiritual, intellectual tradition in the world, bar none. Maybe you could argue that the Jews, it's a still existing one, maybe you could argue that the Jews have something similar, but there's just simply nothing as rich that has dealt with so many issues in so many different circumstances and then been able to integrate it into a single vision of the world. So someone comes along and makes the case and says, I can't believe in those things that have been defined dogmatically. It's simply a misuse of the term, I'm a Catholic, but I don't believe these things. You've kind of moved away into Protestantism or Unitarianism or something else. But here's a much more common thing that I think happens, and only slightly less grave. Suppose somebody says today, in conscience, I believe to divorce and remarry is okay without an annulment. Or somebody says, in conscience, I believe that gay marriage is just as valid as a traditional marriage of a man and woman. Now, in these cases, too, we're contradicting the words of our Lord, and our Lord absolutely forbids divorce and remarriage for any reason. It's our Lord, St. Paul, and the whole Christian tradition, especially on these same-sex relationships. Now, this looks to a lot of people like a judgment of conscience. I know so-and-so, I know this couple, they're okay, there's nothing wrong with it, why should we care? And maybe as a matter of civil law, we have to live with that. But Newman is saying that the Pope is the voice of a tradition that is a tradition that frees us. And the Pope cannot deny. When I was reading this recently, it kind of made me feel like I was back in Rome following the debates. A Pope cannot deny portions of that tradition without undermining his own authority and his own credibility, because the papacy rests on that tradition that he's supposed to be the champion of. And so there's a third case. We talked about denying dogmatic things and then denying moral questions. There's a third case, which is just prudential differences. I can say, for example, someone might say, for example, we should accept as many immigrants, legal and illegal, as we possibly can. As we possibly can is an important qualifier there. We can't just simply accept everybody who shows up at the front door because it would cause utter chaos. But we do always have the principle underneath that we do need to help and welcome the stranger. It may be helping him in his own country, it may be helping him move to a different country. It's a much lower level difference in conscience about the prudential way to deal with things. I would say that this is not a conflict of conscience. It's a conflict of prudence. And the fact that in politics right now we've made these things kind of absolutes of conscience is a further confusion about what real conscience is. I want to close with a hard question that Newman brings up. Maybe one of the hardest questions we face these days. Are we obliged to follow an errant conscience, a wrong conscience? I want to move a little bit more slowly here because he cites several authorities on this question. Here's one that he cites. He who acts against his conscience loses his soul. And he quotes that from the Fourth Lateran Council. He says about it, this dictum is brought out with singular fullness and force in the moral treatises of theologians. Two of them even say that this opinion is de fide. Of course, if a man is culpable in being in error, in other words, didn't bother to form his conscience, which he might have escaped had he been more in earnest, for that error he is answerable to God. but still he must act according to that error while he is in it, because he in full sincerity thinks the error to be the truth. So this is a hard question. Does this nullify everything else that we've been saying in this session? And if we find ourselves, as we do today in most ages, with large numbers of people around us, right, who not only are following a wrong conscience, but have been brought up thinking that they have a sound conscience, because everybody else seems to think that as well, and they're out there teaching it and becoming political activists about it. Newman kind of has a stab at humor at this point. He says, well, what if a pope commanded us to be teetotalers or to hold parish lotteries? He said, could we object to that in conscience? See, he said, we're talking about Catholic conscience now, not just random moral beliefs. And he brings that up because he says, well, of course we see that that's trivial. The Pope he's got to say this to the British Protestants of his time. The Pope cannot command every little detail of our lives like that. But he does go back and he says again, we do have to follow what our conscience tells us about. Those of us who think we have a better formed conscience have an obligation to help teach people who don't have one. And that the authority of the person like the Pope who commands something has got to have a proper formulation for us to feel that we have to resist it if we see something that we think in conscience we cannot follow. He talks about, for example, it's true in military affairs, that a superior who orders a massacre of innocents is obviously not to be obeyed. Naturally, the resistance depends on the gravity of the wrong. So here's what he says about the Pope is our superior and how are we supposed to follow his commands. The word superior, I'm quoting, the word superior certainly includes the Pope. If he to whom the precept is addressed has a conscientious sense that it is a sin and injustice, first it is duty to put off that sense. In other words, not to indulge our what might only be a feeling that we shouldn't be doing what we've been commanded. But if he cannot, nor conform himself to the judgment of the Pope, in that case it is his duty to follow his own private conscience and patiently to bear it if the Pope punishes him. I add one remark. Certainly, if I am obliged to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, which indeed does not seem quite the thing, I shall drink to the Pope, if you please, still to conscience first, and to the Pope afterwards. That concludes the letter to the Duke of Norfolk. Now, lots of Catholics in recent times have run off with that saying at the end. We have to drink to the Pope, but to conscience first. But again, this is to misunderstand what we're talking about in conscience. Conscience isn't just anything that somebody says is right or is wrong. If a Catholic, and presumably only a Catholic, cares about what the Pope is going to say about anything. If a Catholic comes to the conclusion in conscience that he cannot follow something that a religious superior has said to him, it's got to be on the basis of this entire tradition that the Pope himself is the servant of. It's not just my personal will that I think gay people ought to be accepted, or the divorced, or whatever it might be. Right? And it's a Catholic principle that we can only do this because there's a chain of command. That in the military, it's the Constitution, the chain of command, the various officers and civilian authorities that exist. For the Pope, for all of us, it's revelation. It's our tradition. I find that many of the Catholics I talk about conscience with are confused, dismayed, sometimes even angry at the divisions that we have existing currently within the Church. They feel that there are conflicting responsibilities. They think that there are contradictions with what the Church taught in the past, that there have been developments, especially recently, in directions that don't seem to conform to what Newman argued was needed for a true development as opposed to a corruption. And these debates are going to be with us and they're going to go on. It's going to take time to sort these things out. And I've only given you sort of the merest introduction to what conscience means in Newman's case. But let's recall this in conclusion. The Church is actually encouraging more lay involvement than in the past, which I've been at every synod that Pope Francis has called since he was elected. And I can tell you, sometimes it looks like a development, and sometimes it looks like a corruption in Newman's terms. But this makes it all the more urgent that all of us and many other people who care about not only what's happening in the church, but what's happening in our country and in the world as a whole, that all of us learn not only what the truth is, but what the truth demands of us. We've got to make extra efforts to become familiar with this and know how to refute the false understandings of what conscience, free will, these great terms on which a great deal hangs, not only for us personally, eternally, but even in society. So we've got to learn this. We've got to form ourselves to it. We have to bring it into our homes, our communities, even our parishes at times. And especially now, when a lot of the institutions that we relied on in the past, our own governments, our own hierarchy, they seem to have compromised or to even thrown away a great deal of their authority. We cannot expect those large institutions to heal themselves. That is going to be the work of no little time. And so those institutions depend on us. And it's informing our own conscience, informing our own sense of what conscience is and what it demands of us. By healing ourselves and by developing a firmer grip on the truth in our lives about who God is and about who we are and what conscience is, that if the church is again to come to the rescue of the world, it's largely going to be because of what we do in this regard. So thank you. This is an important topic. There's much more, of course, that needs to be said about it, but I welcome your questions or comments.